Welcome to today's webinar. We've titled this The Unlikable Leader, 7 Ways to Improve Employee-Boss Relationships. Let me give you just an overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll talk about the impact of likability, particularly the business case behind this whole question. Who might be a good candidate for at least thinking about this issue? We're going to talk about the challenges that people have about likability. And for those of you who are interested in improving or increasing your likability, we're going to review 7 specific behaviors that have been statistically shown to be highly correlated with this. And then finally, we're going to present a couple of thoughts about how you might get a pretty accurate measure of your own likability. Let's begin by talking about the characteristics of an unlikable boss. I'm not going to read all these to you. You can read down through them as you look at the screen here. But I would particularly, just giving you a minute to look at that list. These are, again, from our research. These describe the people who got the lowest scores in terms of their likability. I would invite you particularly to just think of one thing, and that is, if you'll note that the third item is not a role model, sets a bad example. The 5th item says, gives feedback in an unhelpful way. And the 9th item talks about the fact that this person says one thing and then does another. I call attention to these 3 because these are very specific, overt actions that the leader takes, which are perceived to make him or her unlikable. I call out those 3 because the other 7 are basically things that the leader doesn't do. They're kind of sins of omission rather than commission. So the message that I take away from this is that being unlikable is mostly about what you don't do rather than what you overtly do. Now, the question we mentioned about what's the business case for all this, can you be an effective leader if you are basically unlikable? As you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, we measured the overall leadership effectiveness with a 39-item index that covered a variety of leadership behaviors. This is based on results from 51,650 roughly global leaders. On the horizontal axis, you see their likability is categorized as the bottom 10%, the next 25%, and so forth. And on the vertical axis, overall leadership effectiveness, sort of our grand measure of how effective this leader was. What is striking to me, and Joe, you may want to comment on this, what is striking to me is the remarkable linearity of this, that the bottom 10% in terms of their likability are in the bottom, looks like maybe 9% in terms of their overall effectiveness. The ones in the middle are right where you would expect. They're right in the middle of their effectiveness. And those who are in the top 10% in terms of their likability have about 92% overall leadership effectiveness. There seems to be a remarkable link between how effective a leader is and how likable he or she is.
Yeah, you could predict someone's leadership effectiveness by just measuring their likability.
Yeah.
Maybe you wouldn't like that. But. So, Jack, what would you say to a person that says, look, I'm your supervisor, not your friend? Is being a friend the same as being likable, or are they different?
Well, I think that's a good segue, Joe. Thanks for the next slide, because it talks about, can you be a person that's not very likable and still be an effective leader? And the old argument about, am I your friend or am I your boss, is one that certainly hasn't gone away. So let's just think about this question this way. leadership is basically a process of influence. It's the ability of one person to influence another to perform at their peak, doing their very best work. And I would say if a person is unlikable, then they've got a couple of levers that they can pull. One is their title. I mean, I'm the boss, and or I own the company, or whatever, and you've got to do what I say because of who I am. A second lever that they get to pull, I guess, is that they may be a brilliant technical expert, know more about this subject, know more about this product, know more about this market than anybody else in the organization. Those two things are often relied upon for the influence that they exert. But if push comes to shove, what else can they do? And the likable leader now has a number of other things which he or she can call upon that can exert great influence on the people around them. They can get others to see the exciting vision that they have for what the future could be. They can be very effective in enlisting these people in some really worthwhile cause. We're curing cancer. We're trying to find a new device to monitor and read heart disease more accurately than anybody else has. You can use personal influence, the old, let's win this game for the Gipper, and exerting the relationship that exists between the manager. So, as a good supervisor, a friend, I guess what our research would suggest is, the more likable that you are, the more likely you are to be able to influence an individual, a large group of individuals, the more effective that you will be in general.
But then again, I could be likable, but someone might not say, well, they're my best friend at work, right?
Yeah, no, it doesn't mean to be their best friend, but those are different.
I mean, this characteristic of likability, I think, people worry that this friendship relationship will become too close and that will cause me to be biased and things like that. I think you can be unbiased, and you can be likable, but you're not somebody's kind of best friend or something like that.
Right.
Jack, this leads us to this question of, is there a relationship between likability and employee commitment or engagement? Now, what we know about engagement is it's a bedrock of productivity and success in organizations. Organizations today are very concerned about increasing the level of employee engagement. And what you see here is the same graphic where we have likability measured from poor, bottom 10%, to very good, top 10%. And while it's not as dramatic as the leadership effectiveness, it is really pretty dramatic in that it runs from the 22nd to the 80th percentile. So the unlikable leader, their employee engagement is in the, it's in the bottom 20%. People frustrated, they don't like their job. But if the leader's likable, it's at the 80th percentile. People love working there. Their engagement is very high. I just got interested in that, and we have another measure called discretionary effort, which is the extent to which people will go the extra mile. And again, the likable leader has 63% of their employees who are willing to give extra effort. The unlikable leader at the 10th percentile, only 18. And then intention to leave the organization. Again, the unlikable leader, 44% are thinking about quitting. The very likable leader, only about 14% are thinking about quitting. So this likability not only influences leadership effectiveness, but it influences the climate of the work group, how people feel about it.
Yeah.
So who's more likable? That's a great question, isn't it? Men or women? What do you guys think? Well, if you're a man, you know. It's the women. Women are more likable, significantly more likable than men. Sorry about that, guys. I feel bad about it, too. 53rd percentile on average and the 49th percentile. It's not a huge difference, but it is statistically significant. Who's more likable? Senior leaders or supervisors? You often hear about the grumpy supervisor, don't you? But it turns out the supervisors are at the 58th percentile, and senior leaders and top managers are at the 47th or 48th percentile. Jack, any idea why that is, that we become less likable as you move up in the organization? Being the CEO, you might have some insight into this.
Sure. Well, it is fascinating that as people move through their careers, they tend to be less likable, and that's a fascinating kind of finding from this research.
And maybe it's because the times are changing a bit, and younger people, their emphasis is more on likability, and the older people, their emphasis was on results. I don't know. It could be that as we move higher in organizations, that delivering results becomes really more important. But as you said, Jack, as we age, you can see what happens on likability. Well, for men, it's really kind of tragic, isn't it? So men start out as being 25-year-olds who are really likable. Actually, they're more likable than women. But then, as time goes on, as you hit that 35 to 40 years seems to kind of be this crater point where
turning point.
Yeah.
Well, you did some other research recently, Joe, that I think maybe bears on this, and that is that when people are in their younger years, they seem to be more flexible. They are both concerned about people and people relationships, and they're more concerned. They can be also concerned about producing good results, and they seem to be able to juggle those two and balance them. As they get older, they choose one or the other, and unfortunately, the people who choose getting results are often the ones chosen for the more senior positions. And so I don't know. It seems to kind of appeal to the worst side of them, or the unlikable side of them.
But what's true is that if you look at likability over age, not everyone is unlikable that's older.
No.
Right, Jack?
No, I would hope not.
We're really likable.
I would hope not.
We're hoping.
I would hope not.
So there's levels of likability. It's not you are or aren't. I mean, there's the unlikable, the somewhat, occasionally, rarely unlikable, and then the likable. And if you think about that, it's a gradient. And the reason I bring that up is I want you to think about in this webinar today the idea that we can all identify with this unlikable leader, and you say, well, that person needs to fix themselves. But most of us, 90% of us, are a little bit unlikable, right? I mean, we could improve a little bit. And so the point I want to make here, and I think that's important for this webinar, and maybe the challenge around this is I think we all, well, there's 10% of you that are completely likable, but 90% of you could do something to become more likable. And that's what we'd like to challenge you to do today, is to think about, not sort of think about that really nasty person that needs to fix themselves, but look at yourself and think about, well, what could I do? I'm a pretty likable guy, but I'm not perfect. What could I do to be more likable? So let's think about that.
So one of my favorite stories about this general topic had to do with John Sununu, who was the governor of New Hampshire, who was selected by George H.W. Bush as his chief of staff. He was known as being a pretty prickly, kind of irascible character, and there's this great story told about a young assistant who is in his office one day, and Sununu is kind of musing and sort of says, he turns to this young assistant and says to him, "Why is it that people take an instant dislike to me?" And the subordinate sort of hems and haws and says, "Oh, well, sir, I don't know exactly, but I think it just saves them a lot of time." And he has lived with that reputation most of his career, and there's something kind of funny about it, and funny about this young assistant's comment. Well, the main thrust of our webinar today is, if you, for whatever reason, as Joe has pointed out, we all can probably improve on this dimension to some degree. If you choose to be more likable, what might you be able to do? And so we've listed here 7 things that we have found from our research on 51,000 leaders using 360-degree feedback data. Here are the 7 behaviors that seem to be most directly linked to this quality of being likable. And so the balance of our webinar will be kind of reviewing these 7 things.
And so the challenge would be to find one of these that you might want to work on that might help you. Because likability is this tough topic. If you say, I just want to be more likable, sometimes it leads you to some weird stuff, just like kind of smiling a lot or doing. These are really specific things, and what we know is, from our research, they're the most likely to influence your likability. Let's talk about the first one. Increase positive emotional connections with others. Newton's third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Something happens like Newton's third law interpersonally. It's not an opposite reaction, it's actually the same reaction. What we found is that, for instance, if you're happy and your friend is happy, the probability is that your happiness will affect a friend by 25%, right? That their happiness is influenced by you. And you can even be influenced by someone who's a friend of the friend and you don't even know that person. So your emotions, positive, neutral, negative, are contagious. They spread, and if you bring negative emotions to work, that spreads. If you bring positive emotions to work, that spreads. Neutral just has no effect at all, but it's not good or bad. And the mood, the atmosphere you bring to work stays with you. Now, there's some interesting research about the impact of positive emotions. Now, what these researchers did, they looked at social media, and they looked at what got repeated and retweeted and sort of liked the most in social media. And the age-old adage, if it bleeds, it leads, he said, start thinking about if it cares, it shares. So a good example of that is this story about Chris Hearn and his family. They went to Amelia Island, stayed at the Ritz-Carlton, and when they returned, they found out that they had left Joshie, the giraffe, back at the hotel. They'd lost him. And Chris's son this was Chris's son's best friend. And so he was very upset and had a hard time going to sleep. And so that night, Chris told his son that Joshie just decided to have a little more vacation time. And that night, the Ritz-Carlton called, and they said they'd found Joshie in the laundry. And that, and then Chris said, well, could you help me out a little bit? I told my son a little white lie that the giraffe was going to take a little more vacation time. Could you just send me a picture of the giraffe just so I can show it to my son and let him know he's okay? So they did. They actually got pretty inspired by them. They sent a picture of the giraffe doing some sun tanning, and then down on the beach, getting a massage, hanging out with his other buddies there, and then looking through the internet for some things. Well, this was posted by Chris on his Instagram account, and it went viral. Now, you can imagine what good advertising costs. It costs a lot of money. And so what did these 5 pictures cost? Not much, right? And you think of the positive image that created for that hotel, the really good value that created, the sense that people had. That's wonderful, isn't it? But these positive things occur. Now, There's one thing I'd like to say about if it bleeds, it leads. When you, as a leader, do something aggressive or negative at work, that spreads. That spreads like wildfire. And you don't have to look any further than some of the stories of CEOs who have negative encounters with employees, and it hits the social media. The same thing happens in your office. It may not hit the social media, but it hits the interpersonal media between people. Everybody knows. And so as you think about your interactions with your subordinates, with your interaction with others in the office, make them positive. And for every one of these ideas, we have a developmental suggestion. Our developmental suggestion about bringing positive emotions is to bring them to work. I used to think it didn't matter if I came to work angry or upset or frustrated, but I found that that spreads. And if you come to work frustrated, stay home. Because if you had flu, they'd tell you to stay home. Negative emotions are as contagious as the flu. Bring your positive emotions to work. Bring your enthusiasm and your energy to work. That will spread, and it'll make you more likable.
The next topic we want to talk about is displaying rock-solid integrity. So if you, again, look at the vertical axis on this chart that you're looking at, you're seeing that it's describing this likability percentile of the individual. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at the bottom 10% and the next 25% and the middle 30% on the items that are these. The person's willingness and practice of doing what they say they will do. They walk the talk. Secondly, they serve as a very good role model. They are doing the things that they're asking other people to do, and they're holding themselves out as an example of what they would like the organization to do behaviorally. And they're not saying one thing and doing another. They're being very, very consistent. This quality of having rock-solid integrity is the second really important behavior that seems to be related to how likable the manager is. And so I guess the developmental suggestion that we're suggesting it to you is, do you ever give others the impression that they're doing fine when in reality maybe they're not? In other words, do you write checks that you can't cash? And this quality of integrity looms very large in how likable the leader is seen to be.
I know there's a tendency for people to tell people, everything's fine, you're doing good, but when people aren't. And that comes back to haunt you. I think the other thing leaders sometimes do is they ask other people to do things they don't do themselves, right? It's like, okay, let's hold down with the expenses when they don't hold down the expenses. The third thing is cooperate with others, being cooperative. And again, a little graphic here showing likability. This time we're showing likability in 5 groups, from the bottom in terms of likability to the top on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're measuring your ability to resolve conflicts. And clearly, there's a really strong correlation there. The people that are perceived as most likable are very effective at resolving conflict. Now, this item of resolving conflict, it is one of the lowest of our 49 items. It's constantly at the bottom of the list in terms of skill and ability. Too many leaders think that they believe that if people have conflicts, they'll work it out. They'll resolve themselves. Well, if that was true, there wouldn't be global conflicts and wars and divisions between people if people just worked it out. That would all work out. And that is an assumption that is never true. People don't work out conflicts. And as a leader, you can all think about a time when you were in a work group and there was conflict and people weren't cooperating and how that felt. And it's not good. And it creates a bad feeling in the group. And again, that leader that steps up and gets people to cooperate is perceived as a much more effective leader. I remember once when somebody I didn't know really well came to me and said, "Have I done something to offend you?" And I thought, no. He said, are you mad at me? And I said, no. And I wasn't. I was actually mad at everybody that day. But I thought that was very courageous of him to ask me that, and it got me thinking, gosh, my emotions really show here. The other thing that happens oftentimes in organizations is people assume this is a competition. In school, they were competing against all the other students to get the highest grade. When they exited school, they went to an organization and thought, I'm competing with all these people for the next promotion. The competitors are never liked because they're always trying to get the edge and doing something to be better. So don't compete. We're all in the same organization. We need to work together, and those who compete end up being unlikable. The development suggestion here is insist that team members work together and cooperate. Seek out those who have differences with you and find resolution. Look for ways. And if you feel like there's lack of cooperation in your team, if you can improve that, that's going to do a lot to improve your likability.
The fourth topic is the idea about the importance of being a coach and a mentor and a teacher. I suspect that we can all look back over our careers and think about an individual who stands out, who showed particular interest in us, who took really planned and was very thoughtful in the kinds of things that they did that really helped you progress in your career. I thought about this in my own career. My first job when I finished graduate school was with a strange organization that sold pots and pans in the food industry. And my first boss, his name was Blackie Williams. It sounds like a mafia kind of, but he couldn't have been more of the opposite. He took a real interest in me. He took me on some business trips, showed me what it was like to go do business travel, call on our distributors in the major cities back east. He just obviously was concerned about my development. And I've never forgotten him, nor will I ever forget him. And my appreciation will always be there because he really took time to coach and mentor and teach me. So our developmental recommendation on this topic is have a developmental discussion with the people that work on your team. Find out, what their aspirations are. Hard for you to know how to coach them and develop them if you're not clear about where they want to go, what they want to do. So having that discussion then allows you to deliberately have projects, have assignments, schedule training sessions for them that will really help them in their careers. And that leads people to look at you and see you as being a very likable leader.
Be an inspiration is the next thing. Now, what I've got here is a little graph that shows you, we looked at two different dimensions. We call inspiration pull, this ability to kind of create that pulling, and we call drive for results push. And what you see here is if we look at those two dimensions and we said, which of those is stronger for a leader? And this, again, is over 60,000 leaders. 78% of the population are rated more highly on push, drive for results, than pull. Only 22% are rated high on pull. Now, likable leaders are inspiring. Now, if you think about inspiring leaders, you come up with people like John F. Kennedy, and he talked about that moonshot. And you think about the pull that created, right? It wasn't a push. It wasn't, we've got to do this. It was, can we do this? I think about Winston Churchill and never give in, never give up. Think about Martin Luther King and I have a dream. And think about Mahatma Gandhi and his idea that the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is an attribute of the strong. Now, I don't think you have to be John F. Kennedy or Mahatma Gandhi and do that, but if you can take on this idea that one of the things that I'm probably really good at doing is pushing, and if I could just pull a little bit more. Pushing is actually a good thing to do. I think we all need a little push. But if you can mix it with some pull, if you can be a little more inspiring, it makes a little difference. Well, it makes a lot of difference. Actually, when we ask people to indicate what the number one most important competency for people to do well was, guess what it was? The ability to inspire and motivate others. So your direct reports, they don't want an assignment. They want a cause. Think about how I take it from giving you some work to do to giving you some excitement about doing something that's going to make a difference, that's going to have an impact. So the developmental suggestion here is find ways to improve ideas rather than discourage them. Encourage team members to come up with new, innovative solutions, different solutions. When they come up with those things themselves, the inspiration is there.
The sixth item is very related to what Joe just got through talking about, and that is being visionary and future-focused is extremely correlated with a leader's likability. And that, again, this may be driven by the fact that people in organizations so much want to know, where are we going, where are we headed? And the more that the leader is able and willing to do that, the more likable that person apparently becomes. What do these visionary leaders do? Well, they're good at setting a clear vision. They are willing to share it with other people. They talk about it frequently in staff meetings, in their memoranda that they send out to the organization. They are willing to kind of make a necessary detour when it isn't working exactly well. But they are very effective at connecting what individuals are doing to that broader vision. So we like leaders who give us a sense of direction, purpose, help us see the future, and that quality really goes a long way. So our developmental suggestion here is clarify the vision of your organization. Talk about it frequently. Connect it to the current projects that you see people working on and their assignments. On a regular basis, remind people, here's where we are, here's our destination, this is how what you're doing contributes to that grand cause.
And these suggestions, they help you to become more likable, but for all of them, they help the organization to be more successful. There's not a downside to doing these things. All right, the last one, number 7, solicit feedback and changes from others. Now, what you're seeing here on this graph is the extent to which a person asks for and acts on feedback, and then their likability. And what you see there is that if you don't ask for feedback, you're not very likable, but if you ask for feedback, you're a lot more likable. There's this lovely story about the emperor with no clothes, right? And they convince him, they give him invisible clothes, but everybody else can see him when he walks around naked. And that's a great story because in reality, people who don't ask for feedback, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how effective they are. Think about that person. The analogy for me here is we're all a lump of clay. We start off with just this lump, and at first the environment molds it a little bit and shapes it a little bit, and then other people influence it. But there's a point in time where you discover you can mold your own clay. You can become the person that you want to be, and you can resist changing, and you can resist stuff that other people want you to be. And so you mold yourself. Now, the only thing wrong with this lump of clay is that other people can see it, and they can judge it, and they know whether it's a beautiful sculpture or it's ugly. But as a lump of clay, you can't see yourself. You can't see what you are. And our data strongly suggests that people who get feedback are better and more effective. As you see here, this next graph shows you the extent to which you ask for and act on feedback over time. And what it shows you is that most people, both male and female, early on in their career, are pretty effective at asking for feedback. But as they age, that goes down. And guess who it goes down more for, males or females? Right. And so this ability to continue to ask, to think about that lump of clay, whether it's beautiful or ugly, you can't see it. Other people see it clearly. And the only way you can find that out is by asking for feedback, by checking in with other people, by being open to feedback, and really thinking about the perceptions of others, because that's what really matters. Now, our developmental suggestion is around asking for feedback, and we're suggesting you set a high bar. If you get to a meeting and you say, "Was that okay?" people will say yes. They'll just tell you what you want to hear. So you have to ask something like, what could I have done to make this meeting twice as effective, or 3 times as, what could I have done to really change the outcome or really help this meeting be better? That gives them the cue that you actually want to hear this, that you don't want to just be told you're doing a good job, that you actually want to hear what's going on.
So I guess in the spirit of winding up this whole discussion about likability, when most of us are getting ready to go somewhere important, we often get dressed in a place where there's a mirror. We can walk over and see, is our hair combed and is our tie straight if you're a man, and my dress, kind of, does it match my shoes or whatever if you're a lady, and whatever. The physical appearance is really easy to see when you're looking in a mirror. What's the mirror that we have for seeing how our likability is? It's much harder to get an accurate view just thinking about this or responding to the cues coming from other people. One of the most accurate and efficient and easiest ways to get a measure of your likability is to participate in a 360-degree feedback assessment process. Doing that will give you a candid picture of your likability and your overall effectiveness on the 7 levers that we have described here that seem to go hand in hand with an individual's being liked by their subordinates and colleagues. Many people who have done a 360 in the past know of its usefulness, but you should realize that things do change. You change, your subordinates and colleagues change, the role that you're in maybe has changed. And so if it's been a few years, we would invite you to kind of think about the opportunity of getting an up-to-date, close, candid look. In conclusion, we would say almost every leader would benefit from improving their likability. It's really nearly impossible to be a truly great leader without being likable. And the 7 suggestions that we've outlined here and reviewed do provide a very straightforward and simple approach to improving your likability. Certainly, if you want to improve on this dimension, as in every other dimension, telling those about you that you are working on this, that you would like their feedback, you will be surprised at what you will receive back from the people with whom you work. And so, like John Sununu's assistant, you may get some very surprising kind of comments.
Just saves time.
But we think you'll be very pleased with what you will learn if you will talk with the people around you. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar on this whole topic of the unlikable leader and how people can improve employee-boss relationships.